fun to go out with him. In the early days, it seems like we always had a nice escort supplied by the federal government. Some of the FBI guys assigned to him would always be on their duty tracking him. So we'd go in to eat somewhere, and they'd come in and they'd sit down like they were regular customers. So they kind of stand out with the white shirts and the black ties. And my grandfather would always pick up their check. He said they're just doing their job, and that's all they were doing.
You're portraying him as a very sweet, intelligent, and affectionate man.
He was. He was. You have to remember that we're his family. And whatever his business was his business. And the two roads didn't cross. It was always kept separate to us. So yes, we had the warm side. We had the giving side. We had the prepare his children for the future side.
Your mother was telling me that he never shot anybody.
Not that we know of. There's no heads on the wall that we could say, you know, there's what he bagged. He was the brains. He was the accountant. He was the one that used common sense, who really vested in the organizational part of it. We've always thought about the Riviera being a beautiful hotel that my grandfather spent about $6 to $8 million to build and develop. It was the most modern showplace in the Caribbean at the time. He had been involved with Batista in some of his casinos in Cuba. Had a pretty good relationship going there, and it was the perfect place to do casinos. I mean, the beautiful Caribbean, had the finest in china, the finest in silverware, tablecloths. Everything was brought from the States, bought from the General Restaurant Supply Company, from other prestigious companies.
Tell me how much that hotel is worth now to you guys, or on the market now.
Well, we have been told it's worth 70 million, but it's an old hotel. I feel the property is probably worth 10 million, maybe more. I don't know what property value would go for in Cuba. It's kind of hard to estimate that because it's a communistic country, so everything has a kiltered value to it. Until it's an opened island again, and until the people can breathe free of Cuba, I'm not sure. I would just like to say, okay, well, it's ours. That's the important part, and then to find somebody who's willing to develop it back to what it was. And maybe my grandfather have a landmark in Cuba would not be such a horrible thing, since the island meant a lot to him. The investment meant a lot to him. We feel that there's something owed to my grandfather. I mean, they still consider it the Meyer Lansky Riviera. When you take tours in Cuba, it's still open and operating. The government there takes all the proceeds. And through the kindness of one of my banking customers, I found out that my grandfather was also title holder to the Marina del Hemingway with Frank Sinatra. So I mean, they both owned the title to that property. So there's another property that we consider my grandfather's.
You're confirming that Frank Sinatra did have connections with the mob, which has always been talked about.
Well, he had friends. I mean, his success was probably directly accredited to his friends in organized crime.
Your grandfather also had connections with Joe Kennedy, the father of the president, Joe Kennedy.
One of his early partners in bootlegging and bringing illegal liquor into the country. Well, what was coming out of Canada in the way of whiskey was supplied by Joe Kennedy.
And also Mr. Nixon.
Mr. Nixon, that's an interesting story. Mr. Nixon was a gambler, not a very good one, apparently, and he felt that since my grandfather was doing so well in the Caribbean, he wanted a piece of the hotel. And he sent B.B. Rebozo, Mr. Nixon's henchman, down to talk to my grandfather, and my grandfather isn't threatened, was never threatened by anybody. I mean, his whole life, bigger people than him had tried to push him around. He told Mr. Nixon that he was not welcome in that operation, probably in a lot unpleasant words, more than I'm saying. So I don't see a lot of it coming back to us. I really think that our government would have their way with us. But if we did receive some proceeds from it, my mother would have comfort the rest of her life. My uncle Paul would have comfort the rest of his life, which he's comfortable now. He doesn't need a lot. Myself, I would have the security of retirement. I mean, I've worked hard my whole life. I've never asked for anything extra the whole time. Even when I worked in my grandfather's establishments, I worked for minimum wage. I parked cars. I got tips. I never got anything extra from being my grandfather's grandson.